On May 2, 1945, deep beneath Berlin, Soviet troops discovered the Goebbels children lifeless in nightclothes, and their parents' bodies burned in the ruins above. That discovery still haunts the historical record. History remembers the regime's collapse. The fate of the Goebbels family after World War II was far stranger. There were sealed files, secret burials, and a survivor who went on to inherit an industrial empire. What exactly happened to the name the Nazis tried to erase? The air in the ruined Reich chancellery was thick with dust and the stench of burned fuel. Soviet soldiers picked their way through shattered concrete and twisted steel, their boots echoing in the empty corridors beneath Berlin. In the garden above, two bodies lay half-consumed by fire. Joseph and Magda Goebbels, their features barely recognizable. Limbs blackened, clothing charred. Rain had fallen the night before, turning the soil to mud and dousing the flames that were meant to erase them. Below ground, the search led to a small, dim room in the Vorbunker. 6 children rested side by side on narrow cots, dressed in nightclothes, hair neatly brushed, ribbons still tied in the girl's hair. Helga, 12, Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, Holdine, 8, Hedwig, 7, Heidrun, 4. Their faces were pale, untouched by violence, but their stillness told a different story. Soviet officers stood silent, taking in the unnatural calm. The children's bodies showed no wounds. Medical examiners would later find traces of cyanide and morphine. Personal effects were scattered on the floor: small shoes, a doll, a half-finished drawing. The sense of normal family life, preserved in these last possessions, clashed with the horror of their deaths. Bunker staff interrogated in the days that followed described the children as lively, polite, and unaware of the fate that awaited them. To the soldiers, the scene felt almost staged, as if the family had tried to hold on to a final image of innocence. Floor plans recovered from the bunker mapped out a world shrinking by the hour. The Goebbels family had moved into these rooms as Berlin collapsed around them, refusing every offer to escape. Now their story ended in silence, bodies laid out in order, parents above, children below. The ruins of the chancellery would soon be picked over for evidence, but the question of why this happened, why death seemed preferable to survival, would haunt every investigator who walked those halls. Magda Goebbels had spent years crafting an image of her family as the perfect embodiment of Nazi ideals. Newsreels and propaganda photographs showed the Goebbels children smiling at garden parties, lined up in matching outfits beside Hitler at official events, their mother beaming with pride. The regime held them up as the model Aryan household, a living poster for the future they claimed to be building. But as the Third Reich collapsed, that carefully constructed world turned in on itself. Inside the bunker, Magda's words to those around her revealed a chilling resolve. She spoke openly of the shame she believed her children would face if left alive. A world where the Goebbels name, once a source of privilege, would become a mark of disgrace. Witnesses recalled her saying she could not imagine her children growing up in a world without National Socialism, that survival would mean a fate worse than death. Diaries and post-war interviews point to a conviction that went beyond fear for their safety. For Magda, the family's public role in Nazi propaganda had become inseparable from their private lives. She saw no path forward for her children except as symbols of a lost cause, and no future for them outside the ideology she had embraced. Joseph Goebbels, too, made no secret of his intentions. In his final statements, he insisted that loyalty to Hitler and the regime was absolute. The idea of surrender or flight was to him unthinkable. Magda's letters and reported conversations echo this logic. She described the coming world as hopeless and her children as too young to bear the burden of their family's legacy. In one account, she told a confidant she would rather they died pure and unspoiled than live to see the defeat of everything they had been taught to revere. The Goebbels children, once displayed as proof of Nazi family virtue, became victims of that very myth. The decision to end their lives was not made in panic, but as a final act of devotion to an ideology that had consumed their parents. As Berlin fell, the line between public image and private conviction vanished. The family's last days were shaped by a worldview that saw no life worth living outside the ruins of the Reich. No single account can fully explain what happened to the Goebbels children in their final hours. The details come from a patchwork of statements, some made under duress, others years after the fact. What is clear is that the process was deliberate, involving both sedation and poison, but the exact sequence and roles remain clouded by conflicting memories and missing records. Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician, was present in the bunker, as was SS dentist Helmut Kunz. Both men were later named in witness interrogations as key figures in the children's deaths. According to Helmut Kunz's post-war testimony, Magda Goebbels asked him to help put the children to sleep. Kunz said he injected each child with morphine, enough to render them unconscious, but not enough to kill. He insisted that he left after this, refusing to administer anything further. Yet other witnesses, like nurse Erna Flegel, remembered Magda remaining with the children, comforting them as if nothing was amiss. Flegel described the children as calm, even drowsy, in the hours before their deaths. The next step, the administration of cyanide, remains the most disputed. Some accounts, including Soviet interrogations of bunker survivors, suggest Dr. Stumpfegger crushed cyanide capsules in the children's mouths while they slept. Others point to Magda herself, acting either alone or with Stumpfegger's help. The method is not in doubt. Soviet autopsies found unmistakable traces of cyanide in the children's bodies. But the person who delivered the fatal dose is still a matter of debate. Helmut Kunz denied any involvement with the poison, and Stumpfegger did not survive the war to give his own account. There are also questions about the sequence. Some witnesses, like Rokas Mish, the bunker's telephone operator, believed the children died one by one over the course of an evening. Others, including Erna Flegel, suggested it happened quickly and quietly, with all 6 children sedated and poisoned in a single somber ritual. Soviet pathologists who examined the bodies in the days after the discovery noted no signs of struggle or violence, only the telltale chemical markers in the blood and organs. Official records from the Soviet autopsies list morphine and cyanide as the causes of death, but do not assign responsibility. The lack of clarity fed later rumors and speculation. Was this the act of a mother alone, or of doctors following orders? Did the children sense what was about to happen, or did the sedation shield them from fear? The only certainty is that the process was systematic, with each adult participant later distancing themselves from the final act. For investigators, the gaps in testimony and the contradictions in witness statements left a trail of doubt that could never be fully resolved. The technical process, sedation and cyanide, became a grim shorthand for the way ideology and personal loyalty could override even the most basic human instincts. SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence unit, assumed immediate control over the bodies found in the Chancellery ruins. Their orders came from the highest echelons of Moscow to document, identify, and secure every trace of Hitler's inner circle. Between May 8th and May 10th, 1945, a team of Soviet pathologists led by Major A.I. Chernov carried out autopsies on the Goebbels family at a field hospital in Berlin. The process was methodical and secretive. Bodies were cataloged, examined, and matched to dental records. Magda Goebbels' distinctive crowns, Joseph's prosthetic dental bridge, and the children's teeth, untouched by fillings, were all charted in forensic reports, their identities confirmed with chilling precision. The remains, still partially burned and wrapped in improvised coverings, were now state evidence. SMERSH officers collected jaw fragments, clothing scraps, and personal effects, sealing them in crates for transport. Access to the files was tightly restricted. Only select Soviet officials and a handful of surviving Nazi witnesses, like SS officer Gunther Schwagermann, were called in to confirm identities. No relatives were notified, and Western intelligence agencies were left to speculate. The Soviets treated these remains as classified material, proof that the regime had ended, and that its leaders were truly dead. In early 1946, a new directive arrived from Moscow. The bodies of the Goebbels family, along with other high-ranking Nazis recovered from the bunker, were quietly exhumed from their initial resting place near Berlin. SMERSH transported them 150 kilometers west to Magdeburg, a city deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. There, on a restricted military compound at Westenstrasse 36, the remains were buried in unmarked graves under concrete slabs. This site became a hidden archive of the Third Reich's final hours, guarded by armed patrols and fenced off from the outside world. The secrecy around the Magdeburg burials was absolute. Internal memos, later declassified, revealed that Soviet authorities feared any grave could become a shrine for Nazi sympathizers or a bargaining chip in Cold War propaganda. The location and condition of the remains were known only to a handful of Smersh officers and senior officials in Moscow. Files were stamped top secret, and the chain of custody was documented in coded reports, each step logged in administrative ledgers, but never shared with the public or with the families of the dead. For decades, rumors filled the vacuum left by this silence. Some whispered that the Goebbels family had escaped, others that their bodies were lost or misidentified. But the reality was far more bureaucratic. The evidence, bones, teeth, and bits of clothing remained locked away under Soviet control, moved and reburied as political strategy demanded. It would not be until the 1970s that a final order would come down, erasing even the last physical traces of the Goebbels name from German soil. In the spring of 1970, a team from the Soviet KGB arrived at the Magdeburg military compound with a single instruction: erase every physical trace of the Goebbels family. The grave, hidden for nearly 25 years beneath concrete in a restricted area, was opened under the watch of senior officers. Bones, teeth, and scraps of fabric were methodically gathered, logged, and prepared for destruction. The operation followed a classified directive, Protocol number 462, signed off at the highest levels in Moscow. The remains of Joseph and Magda Goebbels, their children, and several other leading Nazis were transported to a nearby cremation site. There, the fragments were incinerated in an industrial oven, ground to powder, and sealed in containers for final disposal. The remains were handled as state evidence, and the process was clinical and deliberate. On May 22nd, the ashes were carried to the banks of the Biederitz River, a quiet tributary of the Elbe on the outskirts of the city. Under the supervision of KGB Colonel K. Geismont, the containers were emptied into the flowing water. No grave, no marker, no possibility for a memorial. The official reason for this act was clear. The Soviet leadership feared that any burial site could become a rallying point for neo-Nazis or those seeking to rewrite history. The destruction was carried out in silence, the only witnesses sworn to secrecy, the paperwork locked away in classified archives. With the last physical evidence scattered to the river, the story of the Goebbels family passed fully into the realm of memory and controversy, leaving only questions about what should and what should not be remembered. Harold Quandt re-entered a divided Germany carrying a name that drew both suspicion and opportunity. As Magda's only surviving child, he was forever linked to the bunker's legacy, but his future would be shaped by the industrial empire built by his biological father, Gunther Quandt. When Gunther died in 1954, probate records showed an estate valued at nearly 500 million Deutsche Marks. Harold and his half-brother Herbert split control of companies that touched every corner of the post-war economy, including batteries, machinery, and eventually a major stake in BMW. The Quandt fortune had grown during the Third Reich, fueled in part by contracts with the Wehrmacht and the use of forced labor. A study commissioned by the family in 2011 documented over 16,000 forced laborers in Quandt factories during the war. While post-war denazification cleared Harold as a junior officer, the family's industrial holdings remained largely intact, quietly powering the West German recovery. Harold stayed out of the spotlight, managing his business interests and avoiding public discussion of his mother's fate. Yet the economic continuity was unmistakable. The Goebbels name, erased from graves and records, survived in boardrooms and balance sheets, its legacy woven into the fabric of Germany's post-war prosperity, raising questions about complicity, memory, and the cost of silence. Bogensee, once a private retreat for the Goebbels family, stands today behind rusted fences and tangled undergrowth. The house and its grounds, built as a gift from Hitler in 1936, became a symbol of Nazi family life, a place where propaganda and privilege converged. After the war, East German authorities repurposed the site, turning it into a youth camp, and later leaving it to decay as reunification swept away the old boundaries. No grave or memorial marks the Goebbels children. The Soviet destruction of their remains in 1970 closed off any possibility of a burial site, leaving only questions about how or if their story should be remembered. In recent years, local officials and historians have debated the future of Bogensee. Some propose a contextual plaque explaining the site's connection to Nazi propaganda and the family's fate. Others argue for a museum panel that would place the Goebbels children within the broader narrative of the regime's crimes, linking their deaths to the machinery of state violence and the industrial fortunes that survived. A third option calls for no marker at all, warning that any physical commemoration risks turning the site into a destination for those seeking to rewrite or glorify history. Ethicists and memorial curators weigh these choices carefully. Without graves, the absence itself becomes part of the story, a deliberate void left to prevent the laundering of memory. The debate continues, shaped by the tension between acknowledging child victims and refusing to separate them from the legacy of their parents. In the end, Bogensee remains a place where history lingers in silence, and the question of remembrance is left unresolved. Even now, the Goebbels name shapes debates about guilt and memory and inherited power in Germany. Industrial fortunes built in the Nazi era still flow through the Quandt family, while calls for transparency and remembrance grow louder. The legacy of secrecy ensures that history's shadows never fully recede. In the end, silence remains both shield and wound. What do you think? Can the past ever truly be buried?